I knew my marriage was over the moment I saw my daughter-in-law wearing my silk robe in a photograph my husband tried to hide from me. I found the picture just after midnight while Richard was asleep beside me, snoring softly like a man without secrets. The blue glow from his phone lit up the nightstand after a message came through, and for a moment, I almost ignored it. After 42 years of marriage, I had trained myself not to ask questions I was afraid to hear the answers to. But something about the sound unsettled me. Maybe it was the hour. Maybe it was the silence in our bedroom that had grown heavier over the last year. Or maybe it was the simple fact that Richard had started sleeping with his phone face down. I picked it up carefully, more curious than suspicious at first. The message itself was harmless. Just a weather notification. But when the screen lit up, the photo gallery was still open behind it. And there she was. Madeline, my daughter-in-law, standing barefoot in what looked like a luxury condo kitchen, holding a wine glass and smiling at whoever was behind the camera. At Richard. I knew that instantly. Women always know when another woman is smiling like that for their husband. But it wasn't the smile that made my stomach turn cold. It was the robe. Cream-colored silk with tiny pearl buttons along the sleeves. A robe Richard bought me in Napa Valley for our 40th anniversary. I remembered because he'd spent 20 minutes choosing it while I laughed at how seriously he took shopping. A beautiful woman deserves beautiful things, he'd said back then. I stared at the picture until my eyes burned. Madeline looked younger than her 34 years in that soft kitchen light. Blonde hair curled perfectly. Bare shoulders wrapped in my robe. Comfortable. Familiar. Like she belonged there. I slowly lowered the phone and glanced toward Richard sleeping beside me. His face looked peaceful. Old. Strange. I suddenly realized I hadn't truly looked at my husband in months. Not really. We had become two people living quietly beside each other, sharing hallways and bills and polite conversations over coffee while waiting for the divorce papers to finalize. We hadn't fought much toward the end. That was almost worse. Silence can kill a marriage long before anger does. The divorce was supposed to be simple, respectful. Two older adults ending a long chapter with dignity. At least that's what Richard told everyone at the country club. We just grew apart, he liked to say. But lying there in the dark with his phone in my hand, I understood something humiliating. We hadn't grown apart naturally. Someone had slowly pulled him away from me piece by piece while smiling across my dinner table every Sunday night. Madeline had married my son Daniel 8 years earlier. At first, I adored her. Everyone did. She brought lemon bars to Thanksgiving dinners. Remembered birthdays. Called me mom within 6 months. She had the kind of polished charm that made people trust her immediately. Even strangers in grocery stores smiled at her. Especially men. Looking back, I realized she was always careful with attention. Strategic. She knew exactly how long to hold eye contact. Exactly when to laugh softly. Exactly how to make someone feel important. Including Richard. My chest tightened as memory after memory began rearranging itself inside my mind. Madeline insisting on pouring Richard another glass of wine before anyone else. Madeline touching his arm when she laughed. Madeline staying behind after family dinners to help clean up while Daniel watched football in the living room. Little things. Harmless things. Until suddenly they weren't harmless anymore. I placed the phone back exactly where I found it and sat quietly at the edge of the bed. Outside the window, rain tapped softly against the trees lining our backyard. The digital clock on Richard's nightstand read 12:43 a.m. In 7 days, our divorce would be finalized. 7 days after 42 years together. I should have cried. Maybe screamed. Maybe woken him up and demanded answers like women do in movies. But I felt strangely calm instead. Cold, almost. Like my body had decided the pain was too large to process all at once. So it shut the door on emotion entirely. I walked downstairs barefoot and poured myself a glass of water in the dark kitchen. The house felt unfamiliar suddenly. Too quiet. Too staged. Family photos lined the walls leading into the dining room. Christmas mornings. Beach vacations in Cape Cod. Daniel's college graduation. Madeline smiling in almost every frame. Perfect Madeline. Sweet Madeline. I stopped in front of one picture taken 3 summers ago during a 4th of July barbecue. Richard stood beside Madeline holding a tray of burgers while she leaned toward him laughing at something he said. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I noticed Daniel wasn't even in the frame. Funny how betrayal changes old memories. It turns ordinary moments into evidence. I sat alone at the kitchen island until sunrise painted the windows pale gold. Around 6:30, I heard Richard's footsteps upstairs. Slow, heavy, familiar. He entered the kitchen wearing his gray robe and gave me a tired smile. "You're up early," he said casually. I looked at him over the rim of my coffee cup and smiled back just enough to make him comfortable. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. And for the first time in my life, I lied to my husband as easily as he had lied to me. Richard kissed the top of my head before reaching for the newspaper. The same gentle gesture he'd done for decades. But now it felt rehearsed. Hollow. Like watching an actor perform a role he no longer believed in. I watched him sit across from me at the kitchen table, completely unaware that everything had changed during the night. Then his phone buzzed again on the counter between us. Richard glanced down quickly, and for the briefest second, I saw panic flash across his face before he muted the screen. But not before I noticed the name. Madeline. I spent the next 2 days pretending my life was still normal. It surprised me how easy that became after enough years of marriage. Richard still made coffee every morning exactly at 7. He still folded the newspaper before handing me the business section, even though I had not cared about the stock market in years. He still asked if I needed anything from the grocery store before leaving for the country club. Anyone looking at us from the outside would have seen an older couple easing quietly into separate lives with dignity. That was the word everyone used lately. Dignity. It sounded beautiful until you realized how often people used it to describe loneliness. By Wednesday afternoon, the house felt smaller somehow. Every room held a memory I no longer trusted. I walked through the living room dusting shelves I had already cleaned the day before just to keep my hands busy. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily through the silence while rain clouds gathered outside. Richard had gone downtown to meet his attorney. At least that was what he told me over breakfast. I no longer believed anything automatically. That was the strangest part. Betrayal does not arrive all at once. It rewrites the past first. Suddenly every conversation feels edited. Every smile feels rehearsed. Every kindness becomes suspicious. Around 3 o'clock, I opened the linen closet upstairs looking for fresh towels when I noticed one of Richard's old leather duffel bags shoved behind a stack of blankets. It was unusual because he hated clutter. Richard organized everything carefully, especially after retirement. I stood there staring at the bag longer than I should have. Part of me already knew I would open it. Another part still wanted to protect whatever illusion remained of my marriage. But illusions are exhausting once they start cracking. I pulled the bag onto the bedroom floor and slowly unzipped it. At first, nothing looked strange. A few golf shirts, toiletries, a pair of loafers. Then I noticed the receipt tucked inside the side pocket. White paper folded twice. I almost put it back unopened. Instead, I smoothed it flat against my knee. Harbor Point Suites, Charleston, South Carolina. 3 nights. Oceanfront King Suite. My chest tightened when I saw the date. The same weekend Daniel flew to Denver for a software conference last spring. I remembered because Madeline came to Sunday dinner alone that weekend wearing oversized sunglasses and saying she had a migraine. Richard claimed he had been visiting an old college friend in Connecticut. I stared at the receipt while the house remained painfully quiet around me. Even then, some foolish part of me hoped there would be another explanation. Maybe there always is when you love someone long enough. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my cardigan pocket just before headlights flashed through the front windows downstairs. Richard was home early. I closed the bag exactly how I found it and walked downstairs with my heartbeat steadying into something colder. Richard entered carrying dry cleaning over one arm, raindrops still clinging to his gray coat. "You would not believe traffic today," he muttered while hanging his keys near the kitchen. I watched him move around the room comfortably. Familiar. Ordinary. A man completely at ease inside his own lies. "How was the meeting with your attorney?" I asked calmly. He loosened his tie without looking at me. "Long, boring. You know how these things are." I nodded slowly. "Did you see anyone interesting downtown?" For the first time, he hesitated. Just for a second. But after 42 years together, I noticed every pause. "Not really," he answered casually before opening the refrigerator. "Why?" "No reason." He smiled at me then. Warm. Practiced. The same smile that used to calm me after difficult days raising Daniel or paying bills or grieving miscarriages we never talked about again. Funny how even comfort can become manipulation when trust disappears. That evening Daniel called during dinner. His voice sounded exhausted from work deadlines. He apologized for missing family dinner the previous Sunday and promised to stop by this weekend with Madeline. I nearly dropped my fork hearing her name spoken so casually. Richard kept eating like nothing had changed. "Mom, are you okay?" Daniel asked after a pause. "You sound tired." I glanced across the table at my husband. "I think I just have a lot on my mind lately." Richard finally looked up then. His eyes settled on me carefully. Measuring. I wondered if guilty people can sense when the truth is standing quietly in the room beside them. After dinner, Richard disappeared into his study while I loaded the dishwasher alone. The kitchen window reflected my face back at me in the dark glass. Older than I remembered. My silver hair pulled loosely into a clip. Fine lines around my mouth. Deeper than they used to be. Madeline once told me aging gracefully was an art form. At the time, I thought it was a compliment. Now I wondered if she had been studying me the way people study homes before buying them. I turned off the sink and dried my hands slowly. Somewhere upstairs, Richard's phone buzzed again. One notification. Then another. I waited quietly until the footsteps above me stopped moving. Then I climbed the staircase as silently as I could. The study door downstairs remained closed. Richard was still inside pretending to read financial reports. His phone sat charging on the nightstand beside our bed. The screen lit up before fading again. This time, I did not need to touch it. The message preview remained visible long enough for me to read 6 words that changed everything. "I miss last weekend already." Beneath the message was Madeline's name. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake beside Richard listening to the sound of his breathing while the message replayed in my mind over and over again. "I miss last weekend already." 6 ordinary words. That was all it took to erase 42 years of certainty. Around 2 in the morning, Richard rolled onto his side and reached toward me in his sleep, his hand brushing lightly against my arm before falling away again. The gesture should have comforted me. Instead, it made my skin feel cold. By sunrise, I had already made one decision. I was done looking for innocent explanations. The following morning, Richard left early for golf despite the heavy clouds gathering outside. He kissed my cheek before walking out the door, and I noticed the faint smell of expensive cologne lingering behind him long after the front door closed. Richard had started wearing cologne regularly again about 6 months earlier. At the time, I assumed it was part of his strange late-life attempt to feel younger after retirement. Now every detail seemed painfully obvious. I poured myself coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching rain slide slowly down the glass. The hydrangeas near the patio drooped under the weight of the storm. Everything outside looked gray and exhausted. So did I. Around 9:30, my phone rang. Unexpectedly. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something inside me said to answer. "Mrs. Harper," a woman asked softly after I picked up. "Yes, this is Claire Donovan. I hope I am not disturbing you." Her voice sounded nervous. "Careful. I used to work at Harbor Point Suites in Charleston." The coffee cup nearly slipped from my hand. I said nothing. "I realize this call may seem strange," she continued quickly, "but I recognized your family from a magazine article last year. Your husband and son attended some charity gala in Connecticut, I think." My heartbeat slowed into that same cold stillness I had been feeling for days. "What exactly is this about, Claire?" There was a pause on the line. "I almost did not call," she admitted quietly. "But my mother went through something similar years ago, And I remember how humiliating it was when everyone around her pretended not to notice. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Notice what? Another silence. Then finally, your husband stayed at our property several times over the past year with a younger blonde woman. I did not know who she was at first. Then one weekend, I overheard her mention your son Daniel. The room felt strangely still around me. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. How many times? I asked calmly. At least 5 that I personally saw. Maybe more. I closed my eyes briefly. 5 times. 5 weekends. 5 separate lies carefully folded into ordinary life. Why are you telling me this now? Claire exhaled softly. Because last month your husband mentioned the divorce becoming final soon. The woman laughed and said something about finally not having to sneak around anymore. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. And you're certain it was my daughter-in-law? Yes, ma'am. Her voice softened even more. I am sorry. I thanked her politely before ending the call. Then I sat alone in the kitchen staring at the rain for nearly 20 minutes without moving. The strange thing about betrayal is that eventually the pain stops feeling sharp. It becomes heavy instead. Dense. Like carrying a stone inside your chest everywhere you go. Around noon, I forced myself to shower and get dressed because Daniel and Madeline were coming for dinner that evening. The thought alone made my stomach tighten, but I needed to see them together now. Needed to watch how they looked at each other when they thought no one noticed. I chose a navy sweater Richard once said made my eyes look younger. Funny how habits survive even after love dies. By 6 o'clock, the house smelled like rosemary chicken and baked potatoes. The dining room lights cast a warm glow across the polished wood table while soft jazz played quietly from the kitchen speaker. From the outside, everything looked exactly like every family dinner we had hosted for years. That was the terrifying part. Evil rarely announces itself loudly inside families. Most of the time, it sits politely at the dinner table asking someone to pass the salt. Madeline arrived carrying a peach pie from the bakery downtown. She kissed my cheek warmly the moment she walked through the door. You look beautiful tonight, Evelyn, she said sweetly. Not Mom anymore. Evelyn. I noticed that immediately. Her perfume smelled expensive and floral. Richard appeared from the study seconds later, smiling wider than I had seen him smile in months. Too wide. Too quick. Daniel followed behind them looking exhausted from work, loosening his tie while apologizing for another 80-hour week at the office. I swear I barely remember what my own house looks like anymore, he joked tiredly. Madeline laughed softly and touched his shoulder. That is why you have me, she said. I watched Richard lower his eyes into his wine glass to hide his reaction. There it was. A tiny moment most people would miss completely. But once you see betrayal clearly, you start noticing every microscopic crack. During dinner, Madeline kept glancing toward Richard when Daniel was distracted checking emails on his phone. Small glances. Familiar glances. The kind people share after private jokes and hidden weekends and whispered conversations no one else hears. Richard barely looked at her directly at all. That was what finally convinced me. Guilty people avoid each other in public more carefully than strangers do. Halfway through dinner, Daniel excused himself to take a work call upstairs. The second he disappeared, silence settled briefly over the table. Then Madeline smiled at me across her wine glass. You must be relieved the divorce will finally be over next week, she said gently. Richard froze beside her. I looked directly into her bright blue eyes and smiled back, just enough to make her uncomfortable. More than you can imagine, I replied. Madeline held my gaze for half a second too long after I answered her. Just enough for me to see the flicker of uncertainty behind her polished smile. Richard immediately reached for his wine glass without saying a word. His hand trembled slightly against the stem. Daniel returned downstairs moments later, still distracted by work emails and completely unaware that the atmosphere in the dining room had changed. Sorry, he said while slipping his phone into his pocket. One of our clients in Seattle is losing their mind over some software update. Madeline smiled warmly at him. You work too hard. I watched her say it with perfect tenderness, and for the first time, I understood something deeply unsettling. Some people do not lie because they are desperate. They lie because they enjoy control. Dinner continued normally after that, at least on the surface. Richard discussed golf scores with Daniel while Madeline complimented the rosemary chicken and asked me about the hydrangeas in the backyard. Ordinary conversation. Careful conversation. Every sentence felt rehearsed now, like actors following a script everyone understood except Daniel. By the time dessert was served, rain had stopped outside and the windows reflected the soft dining room lights back at us like mirrors. Madeline offered to help me clean up after dinner, just as she always did. Daniel and Richard carried whiskey glasses into the study, while she followed me into the kitchen carrying empty plates. The moment we were alone, the silence between us felt almost physical. I stood at the sink rinsing dishes slowly while she dried them beside me. Daniel seems stressed lately, she said softly after a while. I worry about him sometimes. I almost laughed at the cruelty hidden inside that sentence. Marriage can be difficult, I replied calmly, especially when people stop paying attention to each other. Madeline folded the dish towel carefully before answering. Sometimes people grow apart without meaning to. I turned off the water and finally looked at her directly. Up close, she looked flawless as always. Smooth skin, diamond earrings, blonde hair falling neatly over one shoulder. She had built herself into the kind of woman magazines describe as effortlessly elegant. But there was nothing effortless about her. Everything about Madeline was calculated. Do you believe that? I asked quietly. She blinked once. Believe what? That people accidentally betray the ones who trust them. For the first time since she entered my house 8 years ago, I watched her lose composure. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Her smile disappeared. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. Then it returned again, smoother than before. I think people are complicated, she answered carefully. So is guilt, I said. Neither of us spoke after that. She placed the last plate into the cabinet while I dried my hands slowly on a kitchen towel. Somewhere down the hallway, Daniel laughed loudly at something Richard said in the study. The sound nearly broke my heart. My son trusted both of them completely. That was the worst part of all this. Betrayal spreads like oil through a family. It stains everyone eventually, even the innocent ones. Madeline left the kitchen first. By the time I returned to the study carrying fresh ice, everyone looked perfectly relaxed again. Richard sat in his leather chair discussing retirement investments, while Daniel scrolled through baseball scores on his phone. Madeline curled quietly beside him on the sofa, like the devoted wife she pretended to be. Watching them together suddenly reminded me of an old memory from years earlier. Daniel had been 10 years old when he broke his wrist riding bicycles near our old Connecticut house. Richard carried him all the way home even though Daniel was getting too big by then. I remembered how frightened Richard looked sitting beside the hospital bed afterward, holding our son's uninjured hand while promising everything would be okay. Back then, I truly believed Richard was a good man. Maybe he once was. Or maybe love simply makes us generous with other people's flaws. Around 10:30, Daniel and Madeline finally prepared to leave. At the front door, Daniel hugged me tightly before thanking me again for dinner. Next week will be rough, he admitted quietly. I know the divorce being finalized cannot be easy on either of you. I forced a small smile. Life surprises us sometimes. Daniel kissed my forehead before heading toward the driveway. Madeline lingered behind for just a moment longer. Richard stood several feet away pretending to check something on his phone while she adjusted her coat near the doorway. You seem different lately, she said softly so only I could hear. Maybe I am finally paying attention, I replied. Her expression tightened almost invisibly. Then she smiled one last time and walked outside into the cool night air. I stood in the doorway watching Daniel open the passenger side for her before climbing into the driver's seat himself. Such a small gesture. Such a decent man. As their taillights disappeared down the street, Richard moved beside me with his hands in his pockets. That went well tonight, he said casually. I looked at him for a long moment. The man beside me no longer felt familiar. He looked like someone wearing Richard's face instead. Did it? I asked quietly. He frowned slightly at my tone. What is that supposed to mean? I turned away before answering. Nothing. But later that night, After Richard fell asleep again beside me, I quietly opened my laptop in the dark and searched for the name Claire Donovan had mentioned earlier that morning. Harbor Point Suites, Charleston, South Carolina. Within 20 minutes, I found something that made my blood run cold. A public photo gallery from a charity event hosted at the hotel 6 months earlier. Dozens of smiling guests stood beneath white string lights overlooking the marina. And near the back of one photograph, partially hidden beside a champagne table, stood Richard and Madeline together. His hand rested gently against the small of her back. The photograph stayed open on my laptop screen until nearly 3 in the morning. I must have stared at it for over an hour without moving. Richard and Madeline stood close together beneath white marina lights while people in expensive suits laughed around them holding champagne glasses. Neither of them looked cautious in the photo. That was what disturbed me most. They looked comfortable, familiar, like two people who had stopped worrying about consequences. Richard's hand rested naturally against her back, while Madeline leaned slightly toward him, smiling at something outside the frame. I enlarged the image twice, hoping I was somehow mistaken. I was not. The date beneath the gallery confirmed everything. April 17th. The exact weekend Daniel flew to Denver. The exact weekend Richard claimed he was visiting his old roommate in Connecticut. I closed the laptop slowly and sat alone in the darkness of the guest bedroom I had started using 3 months earlier after the divorce discussions began. Rain had finally stopped outside, leaving the neighborhood silent except for distant thunder rolling somewhere beyond the trees. At some point during the night, I realized something important. I was no longer shocked. Hurt, yes. Humiliated, absolutely. But shock had already faded into clarity. Once people reveal who they truly are, your mind begins rearranging every memory around that truth. Suddenly, all the strange moments from the past 2 years made sense. Madeline insisting Richard join her charity committee because he had such wonderful business connections. Richard defending her every time Daniel complained she spent too much money. The private jokes between them during family vacations. The way conversations stopped when I entered certain rooms. It had all been there in front of me. I had simply trusted the wrong people. Around 7 in the morning, I drove downtown to meet my attorney, Susan Keller. Susan handled the divorce paperwork for both Richard and me because originally we agreed to separate peacefully. We were supposed to be one of those civilized older couples who divided assets quietly and remained friendly afterward. Looking back now, I wondered if Richard encouraged that arrangement because he thought I would never investigate anything closely. Susan greeted me warmly when I arrived at her office overlooking Main Street. "You look exhausted," she said gently after closing the door behind me. I did not sleep much. She poured coffee into a paper cup and handed it to me before taking her seat across the desk. "Only one more week and all of this will finally be over." I studied her face carefully for a moment. Susan had practiced family law for over 25 years. Sharp eyes. Calm voice. Nothing escaped her for long. "Can I ask you something?" I said quietly. "Of course." I reached into my purse and slid the printed hotel receipt across the desk first. Then the marina photograph. Susan's expression changed immediately. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. "Where did you get these?" she asked carefully. "Does it matter?" She leaned back slowly in her chair. "Evelyn, has Richard been involved with your daughter-in-law?" Hearing another person say it aloud made the room feel colder somehow. "You already suspected." Susan exhaled softly. "I noticed inconsistencies in some financial disclosures Richard submitted last month. Transfers that did not make sense. Travel expenses tied to accounts he claimed were inactive." My stomach tightened. "What kind of transfers?" Susan opened a folder from her desk drawer and adjusted her glasses. Several payments connected to a condominium in Charleston purchased under a limited liability company 6 months ago. I stared at her. "Richard bought property?" "Indirectly, yes." She flipped another page. "The ownership structure is intentionally vague, but his financial advisor signed part of the paperwork." I felt suddenly lightheaded. "How much?" "Just over $800,000. $800,000. Richard spent months arguing over simple details during our divorce discussions. He claimed retirement investments were underperforming, claimed maintaining two separate households would strain finances. Meanwhile, he secretly purchased waterfront property in South Carolina. Susan watched me carefully across the desk. There is more, she admitted. I did not raise concerns earlier because technically the transaction occurred before final settlement discussions began. But now, given these photographs, I believe you need independent forensic review immediately. You think he hid marital assets. I think someone expected you not to look too closely. The office suddenly felt too quiet. Outside the large windows, people moved along Main Street carrying coffees and shopping bags while ordinary life continued exactly as normal. A man walked his golden retriever past the courthouse steps. Two women laughed outside a bakery. Strange how the world keeps moving while your own life quietly collapses. Does Daniel know? Susan asked gently. I shook my head slowly. No. And I honestly do not think he suspects anything. Susan removed her glasses and folded them carefully. Then whatever this is, it has probably been happening longer than you realize. I looked down at the Marina photograph again. Madeline's smile seemed different now. Less charming. More triumphant. I want every financial record reviewed, I said calmly. Everything. Susan nodded immediately. I already contacted a forensic accountant this morning after seeing those receipts. I blinked in surprise. This morning, Evelyn, she said quietly, women our age learn to recognize certain patterns. For the first time in days, I almost smiled. Not because anything felt better. Nothing did. But because someone finally believed me without needing an explanation. Before leaving the office, Susan handed me a thick folder containing updated settlement drafts Richard's attorney planned to finalize next week. I flipped through the pages slowly while standing near the door. Most of it looked standard at first glance. Retirement accounts. Property division. Investment summaries. Then one paragraph near the back caught my attention immediately. A clause transferring partial ownership of our Connecticut vacation property into a discretionary trust effective upon divorce completion. I read the trustee name twice before my chest turned cold all over again. Madeline Brooks. For several seconds, I simply stared at Madeline's name printed beneath the trust agreement while Susan watched me quietly across the desk. The words blurred slightly before coming back into focus again. Madeline Brooks. Trustee designation pending final settlement approval. It looked so official. So clean. That was the frightening thing about betrayal among wealthy families. It rarely looks messy at first. It arrives hidden inside legal language and polished smiles and carefully signed paperwork. How could Richard possibly explain this? I asked quietly. Susan folded her hands together. He will probably claim it is an estate planning strategy. Asset protection. Tax considerations. People with money become very creative when they think no one is paying attention. I closed the folder slowly. He was trying to move property to her before the divorce finalized. Yes, Susan answered gently. And if you signed these documents without review, it would have been very difficult to challenge later. I sat back in the chair and looked out the office window again. Sunlight had finally broken through the clouds over Main Street. Everything outside suddenly looked too bright. Too ordinary. What happens now? I asked. Susan's expression sharpened slightly. Now we stop assuming this is an amicable divorce. She spent the next hour explaining financial injunctions, delayed settlements, and emergency disclosure motions while I took notes with surprisingly steady hands. Somewhere during that conversation, fear quietly transformed into focus. Richard and Madeline expected me to remain emotional and distracted. They expected grief and embarrassment to make me careless. Instead, every new discovery seemed to clear my mind even more. By the time I left Susan's office, I no longer felt confused about what I needed to do. I drove home slowly beneath clear autumn skies while old memories kept surfacing one after another. Richard teaching Daniel how to drive in the high school parking lot. Family summers in Cape Cod. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper covering the living room floor. For years, I believed those memories protected a family. I understand now they only protect the illusion of one. Richard was already home when I returned. His silver Mercedes sat in the driveway beside my SUV, freshly washed despite the rain the night before. Inside, soft jazz played from the kitchen speaker while the smell of tomato basil soup filled the house. Richard looked up from the stove when I entered. "There you are," he said casually. "I was starting to wonder if you got lost downtown." I placed my purse carefully on the counter before removing my coat. Susan had more paperwork than expected. "Anything complicated?" His tone sounded light, but I noticed how quickly he asked the question. "Not particularly." Richard relaxed almost immediately. Tiny reactions like that fascinated me now. Lies make people monitor every sentence around them. He handed me a bowl of soup while talking about completely ordinary things. Golf schedules. A neighbor selling their lake house. Some political argument happening at the country club. Meanwhile, I kept wondering how many conversations he had shared with Madeline inside this same kitchen while pretending to care about our marriage ending respectfully. Halfway through lunch, his phone buzzed against the counter beside him. Richard glanced down too quickly before flipping the screen face down again. "Everything okay?" I asked calmly. "Just spam messages," he replied without meeting my eyes. I nodded slowly and continued eating. 10 minutes later, he suddenly stood up. "I need to run out for an hour or two." "Where are you going?" "Hardware store." Another lie. I could hear it immediately now. Strange how obvious deception becomes once trust disappears. "Do we need anything?" I asked pleasantly. "Probably not. I just need to look at a few things." Richard left 20 minutes later wearing the navy cashmere coat Madeline once complimented during Thanksgiving dinner. I waited exactly 5 minutes after his car disappeared before grabbing my own keys. My hands felt strangely calm on the steering wheel as I followed him through downtown traffic while staying several cars behind. He did not drive toward the hardware store. He drove east toward Fairfield Harbor, toward the expensive waterfront district lined with luxury condominiums and private marinas. My heartbeat slowed as realization settled over me. Richard parked outside a modern white building overlooking the water and stepped out carrying nothing except his phone and car keys. I watched from across the street as he entered through the private lobby without hesitation. Not like a visitor. Like someone who belonged there. 23 minutes later, another car pulled into the underground entrance. Madeline's white Range Rover. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. She stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored sweater despite the mild weather. Even from across the street, I recognized the careful way she looked around before entering the building. Guilty people become cautious only after they start feeling safe. I remained parked there for nearly 40 minutes watching sailboats drift quietly across the marina while wealthy couples walked small dogs along the waterfront promenade. The entire scene looked peaceful, elegant, completely detached from the ugliness hidden inside it. Finally, around 3:15, my phone rang through the silence of the car. "Daniel." I closed my eyes briefly before answering. "Hi, sweetheart." "Mom, are you busy?" His voice sounded tired again. "Not at all. I just wanted to check on you. You sounded strange after dinner last night." I looked up toward the condominium windows where Richard and Madeline were somewhere together behind the glass. "I am fine, Daniel." "Are you sure?" The kindness in his voice nearly broke me. "You know you can tell me if something is wrong." Tears burned suddenly behind my eyes for the first time all week, but I swallowed them back immediately. "I know," I whispered. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "Madeline mentioned maybe taking you to Charleston for a weekend after the divorce is finalized. Just to help you relax." Charleston. I stared directly at the condominium entrance while cold understanding settled over me completely. They had already planned a future together openly enough to discuss it around my son. "That sounds lovely," I replied softly. And somewhere above me inside that waterfront building, my husband and daughter-in-law continued destroying our family while believing I still knew nothing. By the time I drove home from Fairfield Harbor, the sun had already started sinking behind the trees lining our neighborhood. Long shadows stretched across the driveway as I parked beside Richard's empty Mercedes. He still had not returned home. I sat in the car for several minutes staring at the front of the house we bought 27 years earlier when Daniel started high school. Back then, it felt enormous to me. For bedrooms. White shutters. A wide wraparound porch where I used to drink coffee every morning while waiting for Daniel to catch the school bus. I remembered planting the maple tree near the mailbox with Richard the first spring after we moved in. We were younger then. Tired but hopeful. Building something together. Strange how quickly a home can stop feeling safe once the people inside it become strangers. Inside the kitchen, everything remained exactly where I left it that morning. My coffee mug still sat beside the sink. Richard's newspaper remained folded neatly near the fruit bowl. Ordinary objects suddenly carried an unbearable sadness to them. The quiet felt heavier than usual. I loosened my coat slowly and walked upstairs toward the guest bedroom, but halfway down the hallway, I noticed the light glowing beneath Richard's study door. He was home after all. I stopped walking. Through the partially closed door, I could hear his voice low and careful. "No, she does not suspect anything," he said softly. Silence followed while someone answered on the other end. "Madeline." I already knew before he spoke again. Once the divorce is finalized, everything becomes simpler. My chest tightened, but I stayed perfectly still in the dark hallway. Richard lowered his voice further. "Daniel will adjust eventually. He worships her too much not to forgive her." For one brief second, I forgot how to breathe. Not because of the affair anymore. Not even because of the lies. But because of how casually my husband discussed destroying our son's life. As though Daniel were merely an inconvenience standing between them and comfort. Richard laughed quietly at something Madeline said next. A warm laugh. Familiar. I had not heard that version of his laughter directed at me in years. "I miss you too," he whispered before ending the call. I stepped backward silently before he could open the study door and returned downstairs into the kitchen. My hands trembled slightly while I filled a glass with water. Richard came down a few minutes later looking relaxed for the first time in months. "There you are," he said casually. "I was wondering where you went earlier." "Just drove around for a while." He nodded absently before opening the refrigerator. "I picked up Chinese food on the way home. Thought it might be easier than cooking tonight." Easier. Everything with Richard had become about convenience lately. Easier conversations. Easier separation. Easier lies. He plated orange chicken and fried rice while discussing some meaningless story about a neighbor's new boat. I listened quietly from across the kitchen island, watching him move comfortably through routines that no longer belonged to us. At one point, his phone buzzed again near the sink. This time he smiled before stopping himself too late. Tiny moments reveal everything once you know where to look. Around 8 o'clock, Susan called. I stepped outside onto the back porch to answer privately while cold evening air moved through the trees. "I have an update," she said immediately. "The forensic accountant reviewed preliminary records this afternoon." I leaned against the porch railing. "And? There are additional undisclosed transfers tied to the Charleston condominium. Furniture purchases. Jewelry. Monthly maintenance fees." My eyes closed briefly. Paid through Richard's business accounts? Mostly. But several charges originated from a joint account belonging to Daniel and Madeline. The words settled heavily inside me. Daniel's money helped fund it. Indirectly, yes. I looked across the dark backyard toward the faint outline of the maple tree near the fence. "Does Daniel have any idea?" "I seriously doubt it," Susan replied quietly. "The spending pattern suggests someone else controlled those transactions." Madeline. Of course it was Madeline. Suddenly I remembered all the times Daniel complained jokingly about how little he understood their finances because Madeline handled most. Household accounts. He used to laugh about it during family dinners. "She is the organized one," he would say proudly. I pressed my fingers against my temple. What happens if we expose all this during the settlement meeting? Susan hesitated briefly. Legally? Richard could lose significant leverage in the divorce. Financial penalties are possible. Fraud investigations too, depending on how aggressively we proceed. And Daniel? Her voice softened immediately. That is harder to predict. After the call ended, I remained outside for several minutes listening to wind move through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked faintly in the distance. The neighborhood looked peaceful beneath the porch lights glowing warmly across nearby homes. Families eating dinner. Watching television. living ordinary lives untouched by secrets like mine. When I finally stepped back inside, Richard was sitting alone in the living room watching a baseball game. He glanced up and smiled faintly. "Everything okay?" I studied him quietly from across the room. The silver in his hair. The reading glasses resting low on his nose. The familiar lines around his mouth I once traced with my fingertips when we were young. I had loved this man longer than I had been an adult without him. That was the unbearable part. Betrayal from strangers hurts your pride. Betrayal from family rewrites your identity entirely. "Evelyn," Richard asked again. "You seem far away tonight." I walked slowly toward the staircase before answering. "I think I finally understand who people really are." Confusion flickered briefly across his face. Then concern. Or maybe guilt. At that point, I no longer cared which one. Upstairs in the guest bedroom, I opened the settlement folder again beneath the bedside lamp and reread every page carefully. Near the back, clipped behind the trust agreement, I discovered something Susan had not mentioned earlier. A printed itinerary confirmation for Charleston dated 2 weeks after the divorce finalized. 2 guests. Oceanfront reservation. 1 king suite. The next morning, I woke before sunrise with the Charleston itinerary still resting beside me on the bed. For several minutes, I simply stared at the ceiling while pale blue light slowly filled the guest bedroom. 2 guests. 1 king suite. They had already planned their future together down to the ocean view. What unsettled me most was not the affair itself anymore. It was the certainty behind it. Richard and Madeline were no longer hiding because they feared consequences. They were hiding because they assumed they had already won. Downstairs, I could hear Richard moving through the kitchen preparing coffee exactly as he always did. Some routines survive even after love disappears entirely. I dressed quietly and joined him a few minutes later. He stood near the counter wearing gray slacks and a navy sweater, reading something on his phone while the coffee machine hissed softly behind him. "Morning," he said casually without looking up. "Morning." I poured myself coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen island. Outside the windows, the neighborhood still looked sleepy beneath soft morning fog. Somewhere down the street, a lawn sprinkler clicked steadily against wet grass. Richard finally lowered his phone and studied me for a moment. "You seem better today." "Better." The word almost amused me. "I slept well," I lied calmly. He nodded slowly. "That is good." His phone buzzed again against the counter. This time, I noticed him subtly angle the screen away from me before checking the message. Tiny movements. Tiny betrayals. "I might head into the city later," he said after a while. "Some final paperwork before next week." "With Susan?" "No. My financial advisor." Another lie. I could hear them now the same way musicians hear wrong notes inside familiar songs. Around 10 o'clock, Richard left the house carrying his leather briefcase and wearing the expensive watch Daniel bought him for his 65th birthday. I waited until his car disappeared before calling Susan. "I want everything prepared for the settlement meeting," I told her immediately. "Every transfer. Every photograph. Every account." "Already done," she replied. The forensic accountant worked through most of the night. I walked slowly into the dining room while she spoke, my fingertips brushing lightly against the backs of familiar chairs. "There is something else you should know," Susan added carefully. "We uncovered additional purchases connected to the Charleston property." "What kind of purchases?" Silence lingered briefly on the line. "Interior design invoices. Luxury furniture. Jewelry." I closed my eyes. "For Madeline." "Most likely." I stopped walking beside the china cabinet Richard and I bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Vermont. I remembered how excited we were carrying it into our first house together while Daniel crawled across the living room floor nearby. Entire lives can become haunted objects once betrayal enters them. "Susan," I asked quietly, "what happens to Daniel after this?" Her voice softened immediately. "Emotionally? I honestly do not know." Neither did I. That frightened me more than anything. Around noon, my phone rang again unexpectedly. "Daniel." "Hi, sweetheart." "Mom, are you home?" His voice sounded strange. Tight somehow. "Yes." "Can I stop by?" I hesitated briefly before answering. Of course. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later looking exhausted and pale beneath his charcoal overcoat. The moment he stepped inside, I knew something had changed. He barely greeted me before pacing toward the kitchen window with both hands shoved into his pockets. Daniel? He rubbed the back of his neck slowly before turning toward me. Have you noticed anything strange with Madeline lately? My heartbeat slowed immediately. Why would you ask that? He exhaled sharply. I do not know. She has been distant for months. He laughed bitterly under his breath. Actually, that is not true. She has been distracted. Like she is somewhere else even when she is sitting right beside me. I stayed silent. Daniel leaned heavily against the kitchen counter. Last night, after we got home from dinner here, she took another phone call outside around midnight. My chest tightened slightly. Did she say who it was? No, his jaw flexed once. But when she came back inside, she looked nervous. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Sunlight moved quietly across the kitchen floor between us, while the refrigerator hummed softly in the background. Daniel, I asked carefully. Are you happy? The question seemed to catch him off guard completely. He stared at me for several seconds before answering. Honestly, I do not even know anymore. Hearing that nearly broke my heart. Daniel had always loved deeply. Even as a little boy, he attached himself completely to people he trusted. When he was 7, he cried for 2 days after our elderly neighbor moved away because he thought she might feel lonely in Florida. That was who my son was. Loyal, gentle, open-hearted. Exactly the kind of man someone like Madeline could destroy without hesitation. Mom, he said suddenly, if there was something wrong, you would tell me, right? I looked directly at him then. My beautiful son standing in the kitchen where I raised him, unknowingly surrounded by lies built by the two people he trusted most. For one dangerous second, I almost told him everything. The photographs. Charleston. The trust agreement. The condominium overlooking the marina. But then I remembered Richard's voice from the study the night before. Daniel will adjust eventually. The coldness of it still echoed inside me. Yes, I answered softly. I would. Daniel nodded slowly, though he still looked unconvinced. Before leaving, he hugged me tightly near the front door. I just feel like something bad is coming, he admitted quietly. I closed my eyes briefly against his shoulder. Sometimes people sense the truth before they see it. After he drove away, I stood alone in the doorway watching fallen leaves drift across the empty street. Then my phone buzzed with a new message from Susan. The subject line contained only 4 words. Emergency update. Check attachment. My hands suddenly felt cold as I opened the email and stared at the first photograph attached beneath it. Richard and Madeline entering the Fairfield Harbor condominium together 3 days earlier. Timestamped. Clear. Undeniable. And directly behind them in the reflection of the glass lobby doors stood another figure partially visible in the background. Daniel. For a long moment, I could not stop staring at the reflection in the glass lobby doors. Daniel stood partially hidden behind a marble column near the entrance, his face turned toward Richard and Madeline as they walked together toward the elevators. The timestamp showed the photograph was taken 3 days earlier at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon. The same afternoon Daniel claimed he had stayed late at work for client meetings. My hands trembled slightly as I enlarged the image again. There was no mistaking him. The posture alone gave him away. One shoulder lower than the other from an old baseball injury in college. His dark overcoat half unbuttoned because he never remembered cold weather properly. He had seen them. Dear God, he had seen them. I lowered myself slowly into a kitchen chair while cold panic spread through my chest. Not panic for Richard. Not even for Madeline. For Daniel. My son had been carrying this knowledge alone for 3 days while pretending everything was normal. Suddenly his strange behavior earlier that afternoon made terrible sense. The exhaustion in his face. The way he kept asking if something was wrong. He already knew. Or at least enough to destroy him. My phone rang before I could even think clearly again. Susan. You saw the attachment? She asked immediately. Yes. The investigator sent it over an hour ago. Apparently Daniel arrived at the condominium unexpectedly while Richard and Madeline were inside together. I closed my eyes tightly. Did he confront them? We do not know. The investigator only captured the exterior photographs. I pressed trembling fingers against my forehead. Susan, he is going to fall apart. Her voice softened carefully. Evelyn, there is something else. I said nothing. The settlement meeting was moved up. Richard's attorney requested tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. Of course. Richard probably sensed things shifting around him already. People living inside lies eventually become paranoid about silence. He wants everything finalized quickly, Susan continued. Especially after we challenged the trust transfers. I stared blankly toward the kitchen window while late afternoon sunlight faded across the backyard. Then tomorrow it is. After ending the call, I sat motionless for nearly 20 minutes listening to the ticking clock above the stove. The house felt unbearably quiet. Every room carried traces of people I no longer recognized. Richard's reading glasses on the coffee table. Daniel's childhood photos lining the staircase wall. Madeline's handwritten recipe card, still pinned to the refrigerator from Thanksgiving. Family leaves fingerprints everywhere before it breaks apart. Around 6:30, headlights swept across the driveway outside. Richard. I remained seated at the kitchen table as he entered carrying dry cleaning over one arm and smiling distractedly at something on his phone. You would not believe traffic tonight, he muttered while hanging his coat near the door. Then he finally looked up and paused slightly. You okay? I am fine. He studied me for a moment longer than usual. You seem pale. I almost laughed at the absurdity of hearing concern in his voice now. Long day. Richard nodded slowly before loosening his tie. Tomorrow should finally wrap everything up with the divorce. There it was again. Relief. Anticipation. He sounded like a man waiting to close a business deal. Susan called earlier, I said carefully. Richard froze almost invisibly. Oh. Apparently the meeting was moved to tomorrow morning. Right. He recovered too quickly. My attorney mentioned that. Of course he already knew. I watched him move around the kitchen preparing himself a drink while pretending nothing had changed. Daniel stopped by earlier, I said quietly. Richard's hand paused halfway toward the whiskey bottle. How is he? Such a simple question. Such a terrifying one. Tired, I answered honestly. He seemed upset about something. Richard looked away immediately. Guilt flickered briefly across his face before disappearing again. That was the moment I realized he knew Daniel had seen them too. Maybe not everything, but enough. Neither of us spoke after that. Richard carried his drink into the living room while I remained alone in the kitchen staring at the darkening windows. Somewhere upstairs, the guest bedroom lamp still glowed softly beside the settlement folder waiting for tomorrow morning. The final performance. The final lie. Around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed quietly against the table. A text. Message from Daniel. Can I come over? I answered immediately. Always. 20 minutes later, he stood in the front doorway looking worse than I had ever seen him in my life. His eyes were bloodshot. His tie hung loose beneath his open coat. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then suddenly Daniel stepped forward and wrapped both arms around me like he used to after nightmares when he was little. I held him tightly while his shoulders shook once beneath my hands. Not crying. Trying not to. Mom, he whispered hoarsely against my shoulder. How long have you known? My eyes closed slowly. Upstairs, I heard the faint sound of floorboards shifting. Richard had heard him arrive. A few days, I answered softly. Daniel pulled back just enough to look at me. The devastation in his face nearly broke me completely. I followed Dad this week, he admitted quietly. I thought maybe I was losing my mind. His voice cracked slightly. Then I saw them together. Silence settled heavily between us while evening shadows darkened the hallway around us. Somewhere upstairs, another floorboard creaked softly. Richard was standing outside the bedroom now listening. Daniel wiped both hands across his face before speaking again. She looked at him the way she used to look at me. I swallowed hard against the pain in his voice. I am so sorry. Daniel stared toward the staircase for several long seconds. Then finally, he asked the question both of us already feared. Does Dad know that I know? Before I could answer, a familiar voice came quietly from the top of the stairs. I think we need to talk.